The crisp autumn air, usually a welcome herald of my favorite season, felt tinged with a metallic unease. A week before Halloween, the air in our meticulously manicured suburban enclave, Willow Creek Estates, was usually thick with the scent of pumpkin spice and the rustle of falling leaves. But this year, an undercurrent of something had settled in. And that something, I was about to discover, had a name, a stern face, and a penchant for wielding the power of the Homeowners Association like a medieval mace. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and I love Halloween. Not in a subtle pumpkin-on-the-porch kind of way. No, I embrace it with the full, unadulterated, glitter-bombed fervor of a child who's just discovered a bottomless candy bag. My house, usually a picture of quiet elegance with its tasteful landscaping and muted color palette, transformed into a spectacle of ghoulish delight. This year, I'd outdone myself. My front yard, a lush expanse of emerald green, was a carefully curated tableau of terror. Towering skeletal figures, their bony fingers outstretched as if clawing at the sky, stood sentinel. Cobwebs, spun from industrial-grade polyester, draped over bushes and clung to the eaves of my house, giving it a spectral, neglected aura. A fog machine, strategically placed behind a cluster of plastic tombstones, billowed ethereal tendrils of mist, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. And then there was Bartholomew. Bartholomew was a 7-foot-tall animatronic Grim Reaper, complete with glowing red eyes and a chilling digitized cackle that, if I do say so myself, was perfection. He stood at the edge of my driveway, his scythe poised, a silent guardian of my Halloween kingdom. My porch was a masterpiece of macabre. Grinning jack-o'-lanterns, their candlelit faces flickering merrily, sat beside plump gourds and cornstalks tied with burlap ribbon. A life-sized zombie, its tattered clothes clinging to its decaying form, lurched from behind a potted mum. I'd spent weeks planning, sourcing, and meticulously arranging every element. My children, 8-year-old Lily and 6-year-old Sam, had been my enthusiastic co-conspirators, their squeals of delight echoing through the house as we tested out the spooky sound effects and debated the optimal placement of a glow-in-the-dark spider. Their joy was infectious, and their anticipation for trick-or-treaters was palpable. This was more than just decorations. It was an investment in their happiness, a tradition I cherished. The first few days after the grand unveiling were glorious. Neighbors, even those with their own more subdued pumpkin displays, would slow their cars, their faces breaking into smiles. Children on their bikes would point and gasp. I'd stand on my porch, a steaming mug of apple cider in hand, basking in the collective Halloween spirit. It was everything I'd hoped for. Then, the email arrived. It landed in my inbox on a Tuesday morning, nestled between a newsletter from my daughter's school and a flyer for a local pizza place. The subject line was innocuous enough. Willow Creek Estates HOA, Notice of Violation. My heart gave a little flutter of annoyance. I'd received these before, usually for a rogue weed in a flower bed or a fence post that had slightly faded. I clicked it open, expecting a quick fix, and a stern but ultimately forgettable warning. What I read instead made my blood run cold. It was addressed to me, Sarah Jenkins, and the tone was anything but forgettable. It was formal, cold, and filled with legalese I barely understood. The core of the complaint, however, was crystal clear. My Halloween decorations had violated aesthetics. Violated aesthetics. The phrase itself felt like a physical blow. My carefully crafted Halloween wonderland, my testament to seasonal joy, had been deemed an affront to the visual harmony of Willow Creek Estates. The email went on to cite specific clauses from the HOA's Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, CCNRs, a document I'd vaguely skimmed during the closing of our house, primarily focusing on the parts about lawn maintenance and not parking RVs in the driveway. It mentioned excessive or unsightly decorations, displays that detract from the architectural integrity of the neighborhood, and a chillingly vague general aesthetic appeal. My mind immediately went to Brenda Peterson. She lived 3 houses down, in a pristine white colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn that looked like it had been sculpted by a topiary artist. Brenda was the self-appointed guardian of Willow Creek's aesthetic purity, the unofficial, and in my opinion, highly unwelcome, enforcer of its unwritten rules. She was a woman who ironed her reusable grocery bags, and whose idea of excitement was a perfectly aligned row of garden gnomes. I'd always suspected Brenda had a keen eye for anything that deviated from her rigid vision of suburban perfection. The email continued, detailing the offending items. The skeletal figures were too large and menacing. The cobwebs were unnatural and debris-like, and Bartholomew the Grim Reaper was apparently a grotesque and disturbing effigy that creates a negative impression. The zombie, the tombstones, the fog machine, all implicitly condemned by their association with the overall violation. And then came the kicker, a fine, $1,000 fine, for decorations. My hands started to shake. $1,000 for a few weeks of Halloween spirit? It was outrageous. It was absurd. It was deeply unfair. My children's faces flashed in my mind, their excitement for the upcoming trick-or-treaters, their pride in our spooky house. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about crushing joy. I reread the email, searching for a loophole, a misunderstanding, anything to mitigate the sheer idiocy of it all. But there it was, in black and white, followed by a deadline for compliance. I had 5 days to dismantle my Halloween masterpiece or face the penalty. A wave of anger, hot and sharp, washed over me. This was not how I wanted to spend my week leading up to Halloween. This was not the spirit of the holiday, nor the spirit of neighborly camaraderie, however much Brenda might disagree. I clenched my jaw, my eyes burning with a mixture of indignation and a dawning sense of battle. This HOA Karen, whoever she was, had picked a fight with the wrong person, and she was about to learn that Sarah Jenkins, when pushed, could be just as formidable as any Grim Reaper. The gauntlet had been thrown, and I was ready to pick it up, scythe and all. The email, a digital harbinger of doom, sat accusingly on my laptop screen. My initial shock had begun to recede, replaced by a simmering rage that felt both justified and slightly overwhelming. $1,000. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. Halloween decorations, a brief, joyful, and ultimately harmless expression of seasonal festivity, had been deemed a crime against the very fabric of Willow Creek Estates. I took a deep breath, trying to quell the tremor in my hands. My mind, usually a well-organized filing cabinet of to-do lists and grocery needs, was now a chaotic whirlwind of indignation. Who was this person? Who had the authority and the sheer lack of Halloween spirit to issue such a draconian decree? The email was signed by the Willow Creek Estates HOA board, but it felt personal. It felt like it had Brenda Peterson's fingerprints all over it, even if her name wasn't explicitly mentioned. I pictured her, her lips pursed in disapproval, meticulously documenting every ghoulish detail of my yard, probably with a notepad and a ruler. I scrolled back to the offending clauses. Excessive or unsightly decorations. Detract from architectural integrity. General aesthetic appeal. These were subjective terms, ripe for malicious interpretation. My decorations, to my mind, were a celebration of Halloween's aesthetic, a whimsical, spooky, and fun aesthetic. To someone like Brenda, it was probably akin to a clown convention crashing a minimalist art gallery. My gaze drifted out the window, towards my front yard. Bartholomew, the Grim Reaper, stood stoically at the edge of the driveway, his red eyes seeming to glow with an almost defiant intensity in the afternoon sun. The fog machine was currently off, but the cobwebs still clung tenaciously to the bushes, adding a touch of eerie charm. The skeletal figures cast long, dramatic shadows. It was, in my humble opinion, a masterpiece of Halloween artistry. And now, it was a target. I thought of Lily and Sam. They had been so excited to show off our house to their friends. Lily had painstakingly drawn a map for her classmates, marking the scariest parts of our yard. Sam had been practicing his best monster growl, ready to greet trick-or-treaters from behind the zombie. This arbitrary rule, wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a potential dampener on their Halloween joy, and that, I decided, was unacceptable. My first instinct was to call the HOA president, a Mr. Henderson, a pleasant but generally ineffectual man who usually delegated all the difficult decisions. But I knew that would be a dead end. He'd likely just defer to the board, and the board, I suspected, was already firmly in Brenda's camp. No, this required a more direct approach. This required fighting back. I pulled up the HOA's website, a sterile, corporate-looking affair that offered little in the way of warmth or community spirit. I navigated to the Contact Us section, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I could write a strongly worded letter detailing my outrage. I could file a formal appeal, or I could just go straight to the source. A mischievous glint entered my eye. If my decorations had violated aesthetics, then perhaps a more direct demonstration of my commitment to Halloween would be in order. A way to show the HOA, and particularly Brenda, that my spirit was not so easily crushed. I closed my laptop, a plan beginning to form in my mind, a plan that involved more than just words. It involved a strategic escalation. It involved leaning into the very violation they so abhorred. The next morning, the Willow Creek Estates neighborhood awoke to a subtle yet significant change. The fog machine, which had been dormant since the email's arrival, was now humming to life, its ethereal tendrils weaving through the morning mist, adding an extra layer of spectral mystery to my already decorated yard. Bartholomew the Grim Reaper, previously standing sentinel, was now positioned slightly closer to the sidewalk. His scythe held at a more menacing angle, and around his base I had strategically placed a cluster of small, flickering LED candles, casting an eerie, pulsating glow. My children, sensing the shift in my demeanor, were a mix of excited and bewildered. "Mom, are we making it scarier?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide. "We're just enhancing the ambiance, honey," I replied, a tight smile on my face. "We're showing everyone how much we love Halloween." Sam, ever the pragmatist, pointed to Bartholomew. "He looks angrier today." "Good," I said, patting his head. "That means he's doing his job." I knew this was a risk. This was, in essence, thumbing my nose at the HOA. But the thought of them demanding I dismantle my Halloween display just days before the holiday, for purely aesthetic reasons, was too much to bear. It felt like a suppression of joy, a bureaucratic stranglehold on a cherished tradition. As I sipped my coffee on the porch, I watched as Mrs. Gable from across the street waved, a broad smile on her face. She even gave a little thumbs up. That was the kind of reaction I wanted, not the stern, disapproving glares I imagined emanating from Brenda's perfectly pristine windows. Then, I saw her. Brenda Peterson. She was walking her perfectly groomed poodle, meticulously picking up after it with a small designer waste bag. Her eyes, as she approached my house, narrowed. She stopped dead in her tracks, her gaze fixed on Bartholomew and the ever-increasing tendrils of fog. Her lips, usually set in a thin, determined line, seemed to tremble slightly. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head. She pointedly avoided looking at me, her back stiffening as she hurried her poodle along. The silent acknowledgement of her displeasure was almost more satisfying than any verbal confrontation. Later that day, a new email arrived. This one was even more terse, more accusatory. It stated that my continued disregard for HOA regulations and escalation of offensive displays had been noted. The language was more forceful, the implied threat of further action more pronounced. They were not backing down. My heart sank a little. This was escalating faster than I'd anticipated, but the anger, the sense of injustice, was still a powerful motivator. I wouldn't be bullied. "Mom, what does offensive displays mean?" Lily asked, peering over my shoulder at the screen. I sighed. "It means some people don't like our decorations, sweetie. But we do, and that's what matters." Sam, however, had a different take. "Can we add more zombies?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with a mischievous glee that mirrored my own. I couldn't help but smile. "Maybe, Sam. Maybe we can." The next few days were a tense dance. I would slightly adjust a decoration, add a new, spooky element, and wait for the inevitable HOA response. Each time, the emails became more pointed, the threats of fines more direct. I received a formal letter, hand-delivered by a rather grim-faced HOA representative, detailing the specific violations and reiterating the initial $1,000 fine. It also mentioned that further violations could result in additional fines and even legal action. The pressure was mounting. The children, sensing the underlying tension, started to ask questions. "Are we going to have to take everything down?" Lily asked, her voice laced with worry. I tried to reassure them, but the knot of anxiety in my stomach was growing. I was a homeowner. I had a mortgage. I had a family to provide for. A $1,000 fine, and the potential for more, was a significant financial burden. The turning point came on Thursday, 2 days before Halloween. I was out buying more fake cobwebs, determined to make my house the most spectacularly spooky on the block, when I received a phone call from Mr. Henderson, the HOA president. His voice, usually mild and apologetic, was surprisingly firm. "Sarah, I've been getting some very strong feedback about your decorations. The board is quite concerned." "Concerned about what, Mr. Henderson?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "About a few plastic skeletons and some fog?" "It's not just that, Sarah," he said, his voice lowering. "It's the intensity. Some residents feel it's inappropriate, and frankly, it's creating a significant amount of discord." "Discord?" I scoffed. "Or are you just bowing to the demands of one or two particularly sensitive residents?" There was a pause on the other end. "Sarah, the board has made a decision. You have until tomorrow morning to remove all Halloween decorations that violate the aesthetic guidelines. If you do not comply, the $1,000 fine will be levied, and we will consider further action." My blood ran cold. "Tomorrow morning? That's the day before Halloween." "I understand that, Sarah," Mr. Henderson said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "But the board feels it's necessary to maintain the standards of Willow Creek Estates." I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. The weight of the situation crashed down on me. I looked at the Halloween aisle in the store, overflowing with grinning pumpkins and spooky costumes, and felt a wave of despair wash over me. Was this the end of my Halloween tradition? Was Brenda Peterson and her ilk truly going to win? As I drove home, the anger began to recede, replaced by a dull ache of disappointment. I pulled into my driveway, and my gaze fell upon Bartholomew, standing tall and proud, a beacon of Halloween spirit. He looked so defiant. And then, a thought, a spark of an idea flickered in my mind. It was audacious. It was risky. It might even be a little crazy. But it was also, I realized, my only option. I couldn't fight them on their terms. I had to change the game. I walked into the house, my children looking at me expectantly. "What did Mr. Henderson say, Mom?" Lily asked, her voice small. I took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of truth. He said, I began, a new resolve hardening in my voice, that we have until tomorrow morning to remove our decorations. And if we don't, we get fined $1,000. Sam's lower lip began to tremble. Lily's eyes welled up. But, I continued, my voice rising with a newfound determination, that doesn't mean we can't have Halloween. I looked at my children, their faces etched with disappointment. And then I looked out the window at my perfectly spooky yard. A smile, a genuine, mischievous smile, spread across my face. We're not taking them down, I declared. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win. The next morning, the Willow Creek Estates neighborhood was abuzz, not with the usual quiet hum of suburban life, but with a palpable sense of anticipation. The deadline for removing the offensive decorations had passed. And yet, Sarah Jenkins's house, far from being stripped bare, had undergone a transformation. Instead of removing her Halloween decorations, I had, as promised, doubled down. Bartholomew the Grim Reaper was now adorned with a rather fetching, albeit slightly tattered sash that read, Aesthetic Violation Victim. Around his feet I'd placed a small, hand-painted sign, fined $1,000 for spookiness. The skeletal figures were now holding aloft protest signs. Halloween is not a crime, and boo lied by the HOA. The cobwebs had been reinforced, and a new, much larger animatronic ghoul, complete with mournful wails, had been strategically placed near the mailbox. My children, armed with their own hastily drawn signs, Save Halloween, and More Candy, Less Rules, stood proudly beside Bartholomew, their faces beaming with the thrill of defiance. They were my little revolutionaries. I, meanwhile, had donned my most formidable outfit, a sleek black pantsuit that meant business, and a pair of killer heels. I was armed with printed copies of the HOA's CCNRs, highlighted sections pointing to vague language and the absence of specific Halloween decoration restrictions. I also had a stack of printouts from various Halloween enthusiast websites, showcasing elaborate decorations from other neighborhoods, all of which, I argued, contributed to a vibrant community spirit. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across my now even more elaborately decorated lawn, I heard the distinct sound of Brenda Peterson's meticulously manicured poodle refusing to budge from her driveway. I could practically feel her glare from across the street. Then, it began. A steady stream of cars, their drivers slowing to a crawl, their occupants pointing and murmuring. Some were clearly amused, others looked genuinely impressed by my audacity. Children on bikes, who had previously been deterred by the ominous presence of Bartholomew, now circled my yard with wide, eager eyes. The atmosphere was no longer one of quiet, suburban order, but of a burgeoning, albeit localized, rebellion. The first official visitor was Mr. Henderson, the HOA president. He arrived in his sensible sedan, his face a mask of strained politeness. He got out of his car, his eyes widening as he took in the full extent of my enhancements. Sarah, he began, his voice a little strained, I see you haven't complied with the board's directive. Mr. Henderson, I replied, my voice calm and steady. I am not violating any specific HOA rules. My decorations, while perhaps enthusiastic, are temporary. They are seasonal. And they are, in my humble opinion, a celebration of a widely loved holiday. I gestured to my signs. These are not excessive or unsightly. They are a statement of artistic expression and community participation. He shifted his weight. But the board felt your previous display was a departure from the neighborhood's aesthetic. And my current display, I countered, holding up a copy of the CCNRs, is a clear statement of my rights as a homeowner to engage in temporary, seasonal decoration within the bounds of the existing regulations. There is no clause that prohibits Halloween decorations, nor is there a specific definition of aesthetic that this display violates. Furthermore, I added, my voice gaining a touch of steel, the board's decision to fine me without a clear, documented violation and to demand removal mere days before Halloween is arbitrary and potentially discriminatory. Mr. Henderson looked flustered. He clearly wasn't prepared for this level of legalistic pushback, especially not from someone armed with printed regulations and a grim reaper wearing a protest sash. The board will need to review this, he stammered. I welcome that review, I said, a small, triumphant smile playing on my lips. I believe a fair and impartial review will show that my decorations, while spirited, are not in violation of any binding rule. And I believe the residents of Willow Creek Estates would agree that a bit of Halloween cheer, rather than a $1,000 fine, is what truly enhances our community. As if on cue, Mrs. Gable from across the street approached, her face beaming. Sarah, dear, your house looks absolutely marvelous. It's the talk of the street, she exclaimed, loud enough for Mr. Henderson to hear. Such spirit! It really brings the neighborhood to life. Mr. Henderson visibly deflated. He knew he was outmaneuvered. He mumbled something about needing to consult with the board and retreated to his car, the protest signs and Bartholomew's indignant glare following him. The tension, however, was far from over. The next few hours were a whirlwind of anxious waiting. I knew Brenda and her allies on the board would not give up easily. I anticipated a formal board meeting, a heated debate, and potentially a legal challenge. Then, around lunchtime, another email arrived. This one was from Mr. Henderson, not as president, but as a concerned resident. It was surprisingly conciliatory. He admitted that upon further review of the CCNRs, the board had found no specific clause directly prohibiting temporary Halloween decorations of this nature. He also acknowledged the significant community interest and positive feedback my display had generated. The email concluded with an offer. Instead of levying the fine, the board would consider a compromise. I would be asked to ensure that all decorations were removed by November 2nd, and that future Halloween displays would aim for a slightly more subdued aesthetic. A phrase that made me roll my eyes, but which I was willing to live with. I reread the email, a wave of relief washing over me. I had won. Not by backing down, but by standing my ground, armed with logic and a healthy dose of Halloween spirit. By late afternoon, the news had spread like wildfire through Willow Creek Estates. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into a quiet celebration of my victory. Neighbors who had previously been too intimidated to speak up now stopped by to offer their congratulations and, in some cases, to ask if I had any spare candy. Brenda Peterson, I heard, had been seen meticulously watering her prize-winning petunias, her face a thundercloud. But even she, I suspected, couldn't deny the sheer delight my decorations had brought to the younger residents and to many of the adults. As dusk settled on October 30th, my front yard was a beacon of Halloween joy. The fog machine billowed, Bartholomew stood guard, and the protest signs, now adorned with tiny glow sticks, gleamed in the twilight. Children, their faces painted and their costumes ready, were already gathering at the edge of my driveway, their excitement a tangible force. Lily and Sam, their faces radiant, stood beside me on the porch. "Mom, we did it!" Lily exclaimed, throwing her arms around me. "We saved Halloween," Sam added, his voice filled with pride. I looked at my children, at their beaming faces, and then at my wonderfully spooky, defiantly decorated house. It wasn't just about the decorations. It was about the spirit of the season, about the right to express joy, and about standing up for what you believe in, even when faced with the bureaucratic might of an HOA Karen. The $1,000 fine was gone, replaced by a victory that felt far more valuable. And as the first trick-or-treaters approached, their little hands outstretched, I knew that Willow Creek Estates, at least for one glorious Halloween night, was a little bit spookier, a little bit brighter, and a whole lot more fun. The aesthetic had been violated, yes, but in the most wonderful and triumphant way possible. And the tale of Sarah Jenkins and her $1,000 Halloween fine would, I suspected, become a legend whispered among the children of Willow Creek for years to come. The crisp autumn air, once alive with the scent of pumpkin spice and the excited squeals of my children, now carried a different kind of chill. It was the metallic unease that settled in my gut, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the approaching winter and everything to do with the official-looking envelope clutched in my trembling hand. The HOA's final notice. 5 days. 5 days to dismantle Bartholomew, to strip my house of its spectral, neglected aura, to surrender to the tyranny of beige and perfectly manicured hedges. 5 days to extinguish the glitter-bombed fervor that had transformed our usually quiet street into a contender for the neighborhood's best Halloween display. 5 days to let Brenda Peterson, the undisputed queen of Willow Creek's aesthetic purity, win. My jaw clenched. Win. Over my over my very much alive and very much decorated body. The thought of my children's crestfallen faces, of Lily's carefully painted ghost decorations being packed away before they'd even truly been admired, was a more potent motivator than any threat of a $1,000 fine. "Mom, is Bartholomew staying?" Lily asked, her voice a hopeful lilt from the living room, where she and Sam were engrossed in a spooky cartoon. I took a deep, steadying breath, forcing a smile that I hoped reached my eyes. "He's staying, sweetie, for now." The email had been a masterpiece of bureaucratic passive aggression. Signed by Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, it was couched in the usual HOA jargon about maintaining property values and preserving the harmonious aesthetic integrity of Willow Creek Estates. But the subtext was clear. Brenda had complained, and Brenda's complaints were gospel. The specific violation cited was that Bartholomew, my 7-foot-tall Grim Reaper, with his tattered black robes and glowing red eyes, was excessively morbid, and his placement near the sidewalk constituted a public nuisance and a detriment to the neighborhood's visual appeal. Visual appeal, my meticulously crafted Halloween wonderland, a testament to my family's love for all things spooky and fun, was a visual detriment. The sheer gall of it made my blood boil. Bartholomew, who looked like he'd stepped right out of a Gothic novel, who stood stoically at the edge of my driveway, his red eyes seeming to glow with an almost defiant intensity against the encroaching dusk, was somehow offensive. I walked over to the window, peering out at Bartholomew. He was, if I was being honest, magnificent. His plastic scythe gleamed dully. A fine mist from the sprinkler system clung to his tattered robes, giving him a freshly risen from the grave look. He was the centerpiece of a tableau that included grinning jack-o'-lanterns, strategically placed cobwebs that looked eerily real, and a spooky soundtrack that played just loud enough to be heard from the sidewalk, a chilling, digitized cackle punctuated by the mournful howl of a spectral wolf. Brenda lived 2 houses down, her own home a pristine monument to suburban conformity. Not a single leaf out of place on her perfectly manicured lawn, not a hint of anything remotely festive or fun. Her idea of seasonal decor was a tasteful, cream-colored wreath on her door. She'd always had a hawk's eye for anything that deviated from the established Willow Creek norm, and my Halloween decorations were, clearly, a glaring anomaly. I had to admit, I'd been a little extra this year. The kids had been begging for a really scary Halloween, and I'd leaned into it. Bartholomew was the pièce de résistance, a gift from my sister who knew my weakness for all things Halloween. He'd arrived just last week, and I'd spent an entire afternoon assembling him. my heart thrumming with a giddy excitement usually reserved for Christmas morning. The email had arrived yesterday morning, just as I was sipping my coffee, basking in the glow of my children's delighted shrieks as they'd discovered Bartholomew's animated arm movement. It had landed like a lead balloon in my stomach. My first instinct, after the initial shock and fury, was to comply, to pack Bartholomew away, to pretend this never happened, to avoid the hassle and the expense. But then I thought of Lily and Sam, their faces alight with Halloween magic. I thought of the sheer joy this display had brought not just them, but many of the neighbors, who'd been leaving positive comments on the neighborhood social media page. This wasn't just about my decorations, it was about the spirit of the season, about the freedom to express ourselves, about not letting a single, joyless individual dictate the mood of an entire street. I walked into the living room, sinking onto the couch. Lily and Sam looked up from the TV, their eyes wide and innocent. "Mom, what's wrong?" Sam asked, his brow furrowed. "Nothing, honey," I said, pulling them both into a hug. "Just thinking." My mind, usually a well-organized filing cabinet, was a chaotic jumble of legal clauses, Brenda's disapproving glares, and Bartholomew's stoic, unblinking stare. I needed a plan. The HOA's CC&Rs were notoriously vague when it came to decorations. They mentioned maintaining a pleasing appearance and avoiding anything that detracts from the neighborhood's character, but nothing specific about animatronic Grim Reapers or inflatable ghosts. This vagueness was their strength, allowing them to interpret rules as they saw fit. But it could also be my weapon. I spent the rest of the afternoon poring over the HOA documents I'd downloaded years ago. I reread the sections on property maintenance and aesthetic guidelines, highlighting phrases like reasonable discretion, offensive or unsightly, and detrimental to the overall appearance. It was also subjective. What one person found pleasing, another could deem unsightly. By evening, a mischievous glint had replaced the dread in my eyes. If they wanted to play the aesthetics game, I could play it too. But I wouldn't be playing by their rules. I would be playing by mine, and I would be thumbing my nose at their ridiculous demands every step of the way. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The sun was shining, but the air still held that autumnal promise of spooky fun. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and headed out to the garage. I wasn't going to take anything down. In fact, I was going to add to the display. First, I dug out some of my older, less menacing decorations. A few friendly-looking ghosts, some grinning pumpkins that Sam and Lily had painted years ago, and a banner that read, "Happy Haunting." I strategically placed these around Bartholomew, softening his grim visage with a touch of whimsical cheer. Then came the real fun. I found a few sheets of poster board and some thick markers. In bold, defiant lettering, I started writing, "Halloween spirit lives here. Aesthetics are subjective. Boo to bureaucracy. Save Halloween. Bartholomew is family." I carefully attached these signs to stakes and stuck them into the lawn, strategically positioning them around Bartholomew and the other decorations. I made sure they were visible from the street, a clear message to anyone driving by, especially Brenda. Sam and Lily were thrilled. They ran around helping me place the signs, their faces beaming. "This is so cool, Mom!" Sam exclaimed. "We're like protesting." "Exactly," I grinned, ruffling his hair. "We're standing up for Halloween." As I worked, I noticed Mrs. Gable from across the street walking her poodle. She paused, a smile spreading across her face. "Oh, Sarah, I love it. That Grim Reaper is just fantastic, and those signs are brilliant." A small wave of validation washed over me. It wasn't just me. Other people appreciated the effort, the creativity, the sheer joy of it. Later that day, I received another email from Mr. Henderson. This one was shorter, more direct, and considerably less polite. It stated that my continued defiance and the addition of protest signage were further violations of the CC&Rs, and that the HOA board was now considering the full $1,000 fine. It also mentioned that they had received additional complaints. I didn't need to be a detective to know who those complaints were from. My heart sank a little at the threat of the fine, but the indignation was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. They were escalating, and so would I. I wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever. That evening, as darkness fell and Bartholomew's red eyes began to glow, I made Bartholomew even more expressive. I found an old battery-operated fog machine I'd bought years ago and tucked it behind a large bush. A flick of a switch, and a thick, eerie fog began to creep across the lawn, swirling around Bartholomew's feet, making him appear even more menacing, and, dare I say, aesthetically pleasing in a spooky, theatrical way. I also cranked up the spooky soundtrack, adding a few more sound effects: a distant creaking door, a disembodied whisper. The next few days were a tense dance. I received 2 more emails from Mr. Henderson, each one more threatening than the last. They spoke of legal action, of liens on my property. But I also received an outpouring of support. Neighbors started leaving small gifts on my porch: bags of candy, a spooky-themed wind chime, a handwritten card that read, "Don't let them win." My own children were ecstatic. They loved the fog, the added sound effects, the whole dramatic spectacle. I knew